The iron skillet hit the wooden floor with a sound that echoed through the silence of the Colorado Territory like a gunshot. But it wasn't the skillet that made the saloon fall quiet, it was the crack of bone that preceded it, sharp and sickening, followed by a woman's strangled gasp that she tried desperately to swallow back down. Maria Castellanos stood behind the makeshift counter of the Double Eagle Saloon, her right hand hanging at an unnatural angle, her brown eyes blazing with a defiance that burned hotter than the pain. The man who had grabbed her wrist and twisted until something snapped, a drifter named Calhoun with whiskey on his breath and cruelty in his soul, sneered down at her with yellow teeth bared like a wild dog's. "That'll teach you to serve slop to a paying customer," he spat, his words slurring together. The stew had been perfect. Maria knew it in her bones the same way she knew the sun would rise tomorrow over the jagged peaks of the Rockies. She'd simmered that beef for hours, added herbs her mother had taught her about back in Sonora, stirred it with the kind of love that turns simple food into something that warms more than just the belly. But Calhoun hadn't wanted good stew. He'd wanted a reason to hurt someone, and Maria, a Mexican woman alone in a town that barely tolerated her existence, had been convenient. The other patrons of the Double Eagle looked away. They always did. It was 1876, and the West was still a place where might made right, where a woman with brown skin and an accent had no more protection than a tumbleweed in a windstorm. The owner, a portly man named Hutchins who smelled perpetually of cigars and cowardice, had already disappeared into the back room. The sheriff wouldn't come, not for her, not for this. Maria cradled her broken hand against her chest, feeling the bones grind together in a way that made her stomach lurch. She could see the swelling already beginning, the skin purpling like a storm cloud. That hand had made 10,000 tortillas. It had kneaded bread that fed hungry miners. It had stirred pots that kept children from starving when their fathers drank away the grocery money. That hand was how she survived in this hard country, how she sent money back to her sisters in Mexico, how she proved every day that she deserved to exist in a place that wished she didn't. Calhoun turned to walk away, already laughing with his companions about the Mexican girl who'd gotten what she deserved. He expected her to run crying into the back room. He expected her to give up, to disappear, to know her place. Instead, Maria reached down with her left hand and picked up the iron skillet. The room held its breath. She could have swung it at his head, God knew she wanted to hear the satisfying thunk of cast iron meeting skull, wanted to watch him drop like a sack of grain. But Maria Castellanos hadn't survived 23 years in this world by giving cruel men the satisfaction of turning her into what they claimed she was. She hadn't walked 500 miles north after her father died to throw away her chance at a new life for 30 seconds of revenge. So instead, she placed the skillet on the stove with her left hand, her broken right hand still pressed against her ribs, and she began to cook. "Your dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears of pain streaming down her face. "And it will be the best meal you've ever tasted." The saloon erupted in confused murmurs. Calhoun spun around, his face twisted in bafflement and rage. "What the hell do you think you're?" "I said 20 minutes, Maria repeated, louder this time, and something in her voice made even Calhoun fall silent. "You wanted to teach me a lesson? Then sit down and learn one yourself." What happened in the next hour would become legend in the mining town of Silver Ridge, a story that would be told and retold until it transformed from memory into myth, from fact into the kind of truth that shapes how people see the world. Cooking with one hand, especially a hand that isn't your dominant one, while the other throbs with the kind of pain that makes your vision blur and your knees weak, that's not cooking. That's an act of will made manifest in flour and fire. Maria had learned to cook at her grandmother's side in Sonora, in a kitchen where food was love made tangible, where the act of feeding someone was sacred. Her abuela had taught her that cooking wasn't just about following recipes, it was about understanding what people needed, even when they didn't know themselves. The body hungers for food, her grandmother had said, hands deep in masa, but the soul hungers for something more. A good cook feeds both. Now, with her right hand useless and screaming with pain, Maria drew on every lesson she'd ever learned. She used her left hand and her wrist, her elbow and her body, turning her entire being into a tool. When she couldn't grip the knife properly, she braced it against the cutting board and rocked it like a lever. When she couldn't stir the pot in the traditional way, she found new angles, new motions, improvising a dance between herself and the food that was part desperation and part genius. She made fresh tortillas, pressing the masa between her palm and the counter since she couldn't work the press. Each one came out slightly irregular, slightly imperfect, but perfect in their imperfection, made with one hand and a will that refused to break even when bones did. She roasted peppers directly over the flame, turning them with a fork clutched awkwardly in her left fist. She made a mole sauce that required 17 ingredients, each one measured and added while her broken hand pulsed with agony that made the room tilt and spin. The other cooks would have told her to stop, to sit down, to let the injury be treated. But there was no one else. Just Maria and her pain and her determination to prove something she couldn't quite name. The patrons of the Double Eagle watched in absolute silence. They had come for whiskey and cards, for the rough camaraderie of men trying to forget how hard their lives were. Instead, they were witnessing something they had no words for, a woman turning suffering into something beautiful, transforming cruelty into grace through sheer force of will. Old Tom Sullivan, a prospector who'd been mining these mountains for 30 years, was the first to speak. "I seen men lose fingers to frostbite and quit working for a week," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "She's got a broke hand and she's making tortillas." "She's trying to prove something," muttered one of Calhoun's friends, but there was less certainty in his voice now, less swagger. "Maybe," said another patron, a young cowboy named James who'd never spoken to Maria before. "Or maybe she's just a hell of a lot tougher than any of us." Maria heard them talking but didn't respond. She was beyond words now, existing in a space where there was only the food and the fire and the relentless insistence that she would not be broken. Sweat poured down her face, mixing with tears of pain. Her broken hand had swollen so badly that it barely looked human anymore. But her left hand kept moving, kept working, kept creating. She remembered something her father had told her before he died, before she made the long journey north looking for a better life. "Mija," he'd said, his calloused hand on her cheek, "there are two kinds of strength in this world. There's the strength of the fist, which breaks things. And there's the strength of the heart, which mends them. The fist is louder, but the heart lasts longer." As she plated the meal, arranging the beef in its rich, complex mole sauce, positioning the fresh tortillas just so, adding a garnish of cilantro and lime, Maria understood what she was doing. She wasn't just cooking dinner. She was offering proof that cruelty didn't have the final word, that dignity couldn't be stolen by force, that some things in the human spirit were simply too strong to break. When she finally placed the plate in front of Calhoun, the saloon was so quiet you could hear the oil lamps hissing. Her left hand was shaking from exhaustion. Her broken right hand had gone from agonizing pain to a dull, throbbing numbness that was somehow worse. But the meal she'd created was stunning, the kind of food that makes you remember why being alive is worthwhile. Calhoun looked at the plate, then up at Maria's face. For the first time since he'd walked into the Double Eagle, his expression showed something other than contempt. It might have been confusion. It might have been shame. It was definitely fear, the fear of a small man realizing he'd miscalculated badly, that he'd picked a fight with someone who fought on a battlefield he didn't even understand. "Eat," Maria said simply. Then she turned and walked toward the back room, her head high, her broken hand cradled against her chest, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the whole. Maria made it as far as the storage room before her legs gave out. She sank down among the sacks of flour and beans, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The pain in her hand was overwhelming now, a living thing with teeth that chewed through her endurance. She bit down on her apron to keep from crying out, tasting the copper of blood where she'd bitten through her lip. Her hand was ruined. She knew it instinctively, the way you know when something precious has been irreparably damaged. Even if it healed, it would never be the same. Cooking was already hard enough with two good hands, how would she manage with one? How would she survive? The door creaked open, and Maria looked up, expecting Hutchins coming to fire her, or maybe Calhoun coming to finish what he'd started. Instead, it was James, the young cowboy, and behind him, a woman Maria had seen around town but never spoken to, Ruth Morrison, the schoolteacher, one of the few respectable women in Silver Ridge. "We brought the doctor," James said quietly. Dr. Harrison was a gruff man with kind eyes who'd served as a field surgeon during the war. He took one look at Maria's hand and let out a low whistle. "This needs to be set properly, and it needs to happen now. It's going to hurt worse than what's already been done." Maria nodded, unable to speak. What happened next was a blur of white-hot agony as the doctor manipulated the broken bones back into alignment, Ruth holding Maria's shoulders and murmuring prayers in her ear while James held her legs to keep her from thrashing. Maria didn't scream, she'd promised herself that much, but the sound that came from her throat was barely human. When it was done, her hand was splinted and wrapped, and the doctor was looking at her with something like awe. "I've set bones for soldiers who didn't bear it that well," he said. "You've got steel in your spine, girl. How much do I owe you?" Maria asked, though she knew she couldn't afford his services. "Nothing," the doctor said. "Already been paid." He nodded toward the door and left before she could ask questions. Ruth sat down on a flour sack beside Maria. "That was quite a thing you did out there," she said. "Quite a thing." "I couldn't let him win," Maria whispered. "If I stopped cooking, if I ran away, then everything my grandmother taught me, everything my father believed about me, it would have been for nothing. I would have been nothing." "You're not nothing," Ruth said firmly. "And I think half the town just figured that out." But Maria wasn't sure what good that would do. Her hand was broken, perhaps permanently. Her livelihood was gone. She'd won a moral victory that would leave her starving in the street. As if reading her thoughts, Ruth squeezed her good hand. "Come see something," she said. Reluctantly, Maria allowed herself to be led back into the saloon. What she saw there made her stop short, unable to process what her eyes were telling her. The double eagle was full, more full than she'd ever seen it. And they were eating. Not just Calhoun and his friends, but seemingly every person in Silver Ridge who could walk. Old Tom Sullivan was there with 3 of his mining buddies. The blacksmith had come. The general store owner. Families with children who never set foot in a saloon were sitting at tables, passing plates of food back and forth. And James, young James, was behind her counter, his sleeves rolled up, doing his best to cook with the ingredients she'd prepared, to keep the food coming even though he clearly had no idea what he was doing. "What?" Maria started. "Word spread," Ruth explained. "About what you did. About what he did to you. The whole town came. Some to eat. Some to pay what they owed for meals they'd had and never properly compensated. Some just to bear witness, I suppose. To say that what happened to you wasn't right." Maria watched as old Tom stood up, tin cup in hand. "A toast," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "To Maria Castellanos, who's got more sand than 10 of any man in this territory. And to hell with anyone who says different." The saloon erupted in cheers and the sound of cups banging on tables. Maria stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring, not understanding what it meant or where it came from. Then she saw Calhoun. He was still sitting at his table, but his friends were gone. Actually, no, they were at another table, as far from him as they could get while remaining in the same room. His plate sat in front of him, completely clean, licked so clean it almost shined. And he was crying. Maria stared at him, this man who'd broken her hand for sport, now reduced to tears at a table by himself. He looked up and met her eyes, and what she saw there was devastation, the kind that comes when you suddenly see yourself clearly and realize you've been a monster. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, the words silent across the crowded room. "I'm sorry." Maria's hand healed slowly, imperfectly. The doctor had done his best, but some things can't be fully mended. 3 of her fingers never quite straightened completely. She lost some of the fine motor control that had made her such an exceptional cook. When the weather turned cold, the ache settled deep into the bones and stayed there like an unwelcome guest. But something else happened in Silver Ridge during those months of healing, something that transformed not just Maria's life but the entire character of the town. Ruth Morrison, the schoolteacher, started coming to the saloon every Tuesday to help cook, bringing recipes from her grandmother back east. She and Maria worked side by side, and slowly, hesitantly, a friendship grew between the Mexican immigrant and the Boston-bred schoolmarm, two women who'd had no reason to know each other before cruelty and kindness drew them together. James, the young cowboy who'd been the first to help, discovered he had a gift for baking. His sourdough bread became famous throughout the territory. He'd never imagined himself as a cook, but Maria taught him that feeding people could be just as honorable as roping cattle or breaking horses, and maybe even more necessary. Old Tom Sullivan and his mining buddies became regulars, not just for the food but for the conversation. Maria learned about the loneliness of men who spent their days underground in the dark, and they learned about a Mexico they'd never known existed, not the Mexico of their prejudices, but the real place with real people and beauty and pain just like everywhere else. Even Hutchins, the cowardly saloon owner, changed. Shamed by his absence during Maria's ordeal, he made her a partner in the business. "You're the reason people come," he admitted. "You always were. Should have recognized it sooner." The Double Eagle Saloon transformed from a rough drinking establishment into something more, a community center where people gathered not just to forget their troubles but to share them. Where miners and cowboys sat down with shopkeepers and their families. Where Mexican and American and Chinese and German immigrants broke bread together and discovered they all bled the same color and laughed at the same jokes and cried at the same sorrows. And Calhoun? He left town 3 days after the incident, unable to bear the weight of what he'd done and what he'd seen. But 6 months later, a letter arrived for Maria, postmarked from California. In it, Calhoun explained that he'd joined a monastery, that he was trying to atone for a lifetime of cruelty, that watching her cook with a broken hand while he'd sat there with 2 good ones had shattered something in him that needed shattering. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that you changed me. You showed me that strength isn't about how much damage you can do, it's about how much you can bear and still choose kindness. I'm trying to learn that now. I'm trying to be worthy of the mercy you showed by not striking me when you had every right to." Maria read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in the box where she kept her most precious things, letters from her sisters in Mexico, a photograph of her father, a recipe card in her grandmother's handwriting. She didn't forgive Calhoun, exactly, forgiveness felt too simple for something so complicated. But she understood that pain could be transformative, that sometimes breaking is the first step toward becoming whole in a new way. 1 year after the incident, on a cold November evening when snow was just beginning to dust the peaks of the Rockies, the town held a celebration. They called it Maria's Feast, though she protested the name. Long tables were set up in the street outside the Double Eagle, laden with food prepared by dozens of hands, Maria directing the effort, teaching, guiding, sharing the knowledge her grandmother had given her. There were tamales and tortillas and mole, but also Ruth's New England clam chowder and James's sourdough and the dumplings taught by Mrs. Chen from the laundry. It was a feast that honored not just Maria but the principle she'd lived, that feeding people with love and dignity was a revolutionary act, that kindness in the face of cruelty could transform the world one meal at a time. Dr. Harrison stood to give a speech, his breath fogging in the cold air. "A year ago," he said, "this town witnessed an act of cruelty. We watched a woman's hand get broken for the crime of doing her job well. And we did nothing. We thought we lived in a place where might made right, where the strong did what they wanted and the weak suffered in silence. But Maria Castellanos showed us different. She showed us that real strength isn't in the fist, it's in the heart that keeps beating even when the fist has done its worst. She showed us that dignity can't be broken by force, that some things in the human spirit are simply too strong to shatter." And I